And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm doing something a little bit topical today. So just to give you a little bit of context, if you're not listening to this from the UK, the sort of insanity in Britain this week is that the Sun newspaper has accused an unnamed television celebrity of some sexual offence. And there is a kind of like a hysteria over naming this person. The only problem, of course, is that the person who is supposedly the victim has said the story is complete nonsense, and now it kind of limps along like some sort of kind of undead urban myth. Okay, so that's the first part of the context. The other part of the context is that veteran rocker and rock star and entertainer and kind of national treasure Elton John is now performing his last concerts ever. He's on his farewell tour and sort of lit up the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury only recently. So these two things together put me in mind of a particular incident in British media history in 1989 of the libel, the biggest ever libel payout against the Sun newspaper from Elton John. And so today we're looking in the Faber Book of Pop, which is an amazing anthology of pop music and rock music history, about this particular episode. The reason for this is because it tells us a powerful story about the kind of the way in which Britain has been run through the right-wing tabloid media for the past sort of 40 years or so, and the impunity with which it operates, an impunity which is perhaps coming to an end, but we shall see. Anyway, let's explore the Faber Book of Pop, and the journalist who wrote this article for the anthology is the journalist John Sweeney. And John Sweeney writes, Sleazy? Sleazy is not the word. Sleazy comes nowhere to conveying the full ripeness of the Apollo Club, members only, perched in a Soho attic. There had just been a fight outside on the street. The loser, a fresh-faced lad, breathing fast, pleads for admission. There are bottles out there, but the pig-necked bouncer is having none of it. You're not coming in here getting Larry with me, son. Inside, the ambience owes something to a motorway service station urinal. No women are in sight. No one comes to the Apollo for a chat, or indeed the view. A side-on glimpse of the squeaky clean Swiss centre through matte black windows and grubbier windows. Elderly businessmen tinker with their gins and tonics. Smut-moustached young men look on, waiting to be picked up, as bored as Tesco checkout girls. They drink, smile queasily, and then hit the streets. It was at the Apollo in early 1987 that the story of Britain's biggest libel action began, when the Sun newspaper got in touch with the rent boy turned pimp Graham X, who frequented the club. There followed a series of stories about the rock singer Elton John. The stories, based on Graham X's souped-up confessions, were as untrue as they were nasty. The first Elton and Vice Boys scandal, published on Wednesday the 25th of February 1987, contains the gist of all that was to come. Graham X confessed to supplying Elton John and Billy Gaff, a pop manager, with at least 10 youngsters who each were paid a minimum of £100 plus all the cocaine they could stand. Elton sued. The Sun printed more and nastier stories. Elton sued again and again, issuing in all 17 writs against the Sun from February to September 1987. The writs led, last Christmas, to a grovelling front-page apology by the Sun. It is a grisly and sorry tale, from the rent boys who lied to the Sun's money to an incredulous RSPCA inspector who was asked to investigate the case of the dogs that didn't bark. John Sweeney writes, It started with a tip-off at the beginning of the year. The Sun was told by one of its regular sneaks, paid on a story-by-story basis, that the good-looking teenage rent boy with an angelic face could be sitting on a cracker of a story. The sneak pocketed his money and disappeared from view. The Sun left word at the Apollo that it wanted to get in touch with the rent boy, later to be called Graham X, but who was known at West, that is, in the West End, as Barry Alexander or American Barry. It is a peculiarly common feature of young people who have broken from their families to claim that they are American or that their family has moved to America. His real name is Stephen Hardy. No one should be in the least bit surprised that the Sun was interested in the kiss and tell stories of a male prostitute. Britain's most profitable newspaper has built its massive sales at roughly 4.25 million. By the way, they are nothing like that now, and the Sun has failed to turn a profit for at least 2 of the last years. Roughly 4.25 million. More than 10 times as many as those of the Independent, on a diet of virulent xenophobia and soft pornography, all streaked with a slickness which is the hallmark of its editor, Kelvin Mackenzie. Mackenzie comes from a family of journalists in South London. On his first paper as a cub reporter, he was sick over the editor's suede shoes. Such stories have lent weight to the cartoon view of Mackenzie that he's just a sewer-mouthed jobbo. But Mackenzie is a brilliant tabloid editor and perhaps the most powerful journalist in the country. Under his stewardship, the Sun is disproportionately admired in Fleet Street as a well-made thing. It makes for a repulsive but fascinating read, pored over by 13 million Britons a day. 13 million people in Britain every day in the 1980s read this newspaper, and the 1990s and into the 2000s. And it goes a long way to offering explanations about the kind of social and cultural history of Britain in the past 30 or 40 years. Perhaps when the Sun is dead and buried, and the Murdoch Empire has divested itself of it, as I presume it will do once Rupert Murdoch has passed away, perhaps there will be a more profound understanding or reckoning with the Sun's influence on Great Britain, and its sort of degradation of British public life. Stephen Hardy, of course, was and is a regular Sun reader. Everybody who reads it hasn't got a GCSE between them, he told me, and fairly rubbishing at least one reader, the Sun's editor, who had one GCE and O-level in art. Hardy existed, and to an extent still does, in a world of rapidly shifting loyalties and fuzzily transmitted reality. In 1987, when he was not quite 20, he was living in Twyford, Berkshire, but making frequent trips up west. Hardy is a blonde, slightly built sharp dresser whose surfeit of identities comes in handy in his line of business. He often speaks with an American accent, although prosaically he originally came from a small village somewhere off the M1 near Nottingham. An adopted child, he says that he had been expelled from 4 schools before posing naked in a male porn magazine. He was paid £100 for the first nude modelling job in 1983 when he was a baby-faced 16. I was on the streets and had nowhere to go. He says, it was either that or sleeping with people. Nothing Hardy says should be taken as gospel, but clearly his childhood could hardly have been described as conventionally happy. Suspecting that there might be money in it, Hardy followed up the Sun's approach and phoned Craig Mackenzie on the paper's Bizarre column, which features pop gossip and singles charts. Craig Mackenzie, who lives in the shadow of his editor brother, has since left the Sun to join the Daily Express. In 1987, Craig, whose Sun nickname was Bouncing Bogbrush, was in a hurry, anxious to prove himself his own man. The old nursery competitiveness between brothers Mackenzie partly explains why neither of them ever dared to get off the ruinous track that they are on. It was to cost the Sun proprietor, Rupert Murdoch, £1 million in damages and probably half as much again in costs. When Hardy told Craig Mackenzie on the phone, what Hardy told Craig Mackenzie on the phone was sufficiently promising for a Sun team to roar into the forecourt of Twyford railway station in Berkshire in a black Porsche. Hardy was impressed, as the journalists had intended. At the time, Hardy was working as a laundry presser in the village, earning £120 a week, and living in a council house with his then girlfriend and their baby son. Hardy told Craig Mackenzie that he'd been to several parties thrown by Rod Stewart's former manager, Billy Gaff, at his Great Gatsby in the home county's Kitch Manor in Finchampstead, near Elton John's Windsor home, and not far from Hardy's Twyford council house. Hardy also told a lurid story about the supplying of other rent boys, an expenses paid trip to New York, and vast cocaine consumption. Gaff's name cropped up in a number of times, but Elton John's name was only mentioned as someone who was on the fringe of the scene. Billy Gaff is one of the great 70s rock managers, embodying all the vivid, platform-sold excesses of the era before the greyer 80s. An interesting, somewhat hyperactive mixture of voluble Irishman and Hollywood camp, he made his first fortune managing Rod Stewart. Gaff went on to repeat his success by managing John Cougar Mellencamp, a hugely popular American singer in the Bruce Springsteen mould. Although Gaff and Elton John knew each other, Gaff is a great deal closer to Elton's manager, a Scottish terrier of a man called John Reid. Both men are gay. A friend of mine went to a couple at Billy Gaff's parties at roughly the same time as Hardy. One of the features of both parties was the presence of a not to repeat, sweet-faced young men looking lost. Now, those that have even kind of followed the news in passing in Britain in the last 10 years will be aware of generational scandals of predatory celebrities preying on young men and young women in these sorts of circumstances, and even darker kind of circumstances. So the kind of the context of this story is sort of hardly surprising. John Sweeney writes, a story linking Rent Boys with Billy Gaff, whether true or untrue, would not cut much ice with the Sun's readers, to whom Gaff was hardly a household name. It was the name Elton John which crackled in the Sun journalists' ears. Elton John was what Hardy's new customers wanted to hear, so that's what they got. Hardy was sent a rail ticket and invited down to Wapping to meet the editor. Hardy had a good recollection of the fateful meeting. He had to brave the NGA pickets at the time. The Print Workers Union were picketing Wapping, where Rupert Murdoch had moved the production process and digitised it and laid off print workers and typesetters and that sort of thing. The print workers were still screaming. The strikers were still screaming scab after almost a year of standing outside the NATO issue razor wire of Rupert Murdoch's massive print plant. In the room were the brothers Mackenzie and the paper's then deputy editor David Shapland, who had since left to run a sports features agency. Hardy got on all right with Craig Mackenzie and Shapland, but he did not warm to the editor. I didn't like his attitude. One minute he was a semi-Australian hard-talking guy, the next he was like a puppy. To help Craig Mackenzie, who had the responsibility of turning out the bizarre column, Sun writer Neil Wallace was drafted into the Elton John investigation. Wallace had previously worked on the Sun's gutter rival, the Daily Star, where he was billed with becoming modesty as the world's greatest reporter. Fleet Street legend has it that Wallace, a jovial Mancunian nicknamed Wolfman because of his lupine beard, is something of a chancer. As far as the Press Council goes, the mythology does not bear close examination. According to the Council, Wallace is cited in only one adjudication in recent years for the story entitled "This Child Was Told Christmas Joy is Evil," a minor classic of the genre. As it happens, the Press Council rejected the complaint against Wallace and the paper that he then worked for. A mole at the Sun takes up the story. After 2 weeks of investigation, Wallace and Craig Mackenzie felt they were 90% sure that something untoward had gone on at Billy Gaff's house and that drugs were in abundance. Kelvin nagged them for a date. They had rough dates, but nothing specific. Eventually, they settled on a specific date, which proved to be a big mistake. Needless to say, there was no discussion whether it was a just story to run. No one at the Sun discusses morality. It's worth stopping to reflect, just for a moment, that the kinds of things we're talking about here, of making unfounded accusations, making libelous accusations, happen on a kind of a regular basis. They happen so often that it is almost almost like an industrial process, and that newspapers like the Sun can take £1 million hits and often don't mind doing so because they sell, in excess of many multiples of that in advertising space and sales revenue. The thing also is that this happens routinely to ordinary people without Elton John's resources. And there has been, even following the kind of the almost death of the tabloid industry in 2011 during the Leveson inquiry, where they had the entire system had a near-death experience. On a separate scandal that perhaps we'll talk about another time. Helpful governments which are kind of intimately connected to, and both are Labour and Conservative, intimately connected with the tabloid industry, and they have a symbiotic relationship with, help their old friends out. On the eve of publication, Mackenzie had an intimation of disaster. The front page splash had been made up, in every sense of the word. Elton John in Vice Boys scandal. He stood in front of it, admiring his handiwork. Right then, he said, let's fucking go for it. Elton John, we're going down the pan. We're all going down the pan. And with that, he held his beaky nose and mimicked the pulling of a lavatory chain. The gesture was to prove prophetic. The story, dated Wednesday the 25th of February 1987, carried two bylines by Craig Mackenzie and Neil Wallace, and was in traditional Sun style. The singer, the Sun alleged, snorted cocaine while begging tattooed skinheads to indulge in bondage. Everything was based on uncorroborated evidence of a rent boy, and rent boys are notoriously bad witnesses. Who now says 90% of was untrue, according to Hardy. I would give them a line and they would write it up. It was a manufactured story. The final paragraph of the front page story put the usual gutter tabloid po-faced sanctimony in the mouth of Graham X. I am ashamed of what I did. I am speaking out now to show how widespread this sort of thing is, and to warn other gullible young kids to steer clear of people like these. The story failed to add that Sun had paid Graham £2,000 for his altruism, and was to pay him another £250 a week for the next few months. John Sweeney writes, for people of my generation in their 30s, this is obviously going back a bit, Elton Hercules John is the Vera Lynn de nos jours. Songs like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting provided the noise wallpaper for our parties and teenage discos. More than that, Elton, born Reginald Keith Dwight, did not, as Jagger and Lennon did, become a tax exile and disappear off into megastardom. He therefore occupies a homely, warm place in our affections. He is judged ideologically cuddly enough to be the first Western rock star to play in the Soviet Union and visit China, and although he had pink hair long before Johnny Rotten gobbed and shocked at journalists, Elton was a friend of Prince Andrew and would willingly fly 12,000 miles to see his beloved Watford, the football club he owns, achieve a goalless draw against Charlton Athletic. Elton's essential homeliness wasn't in the least compromised by his admission in 1976 he was bisexual. There's nothing wrong with going to bed with somebody of your own sex. Such honesty by a public figure marked a departure from the traditional closeted mentality which imprisoned many showbiz homosexuals. It was rewarded by mass chanting of Elton John's approof by opposing football fans. Sorry for the homophobic language, but we're talking about, referencing how kind of people have spoken in the past, but there you go. And these were chants that he braved. Facing up to this potentially destructive experience, he had a lot to do with the robustness with which he took the Sun head-on a decade later. He is not, however, an angel. His lifestyle in the early 70s, when he was at the peak of his success, might well have excited the moral seraphim at the Sun if they had been minded to pore over it in any great detail. Rumours about him have even reached the ears of the royal family. According to a recent biography of him, at a concert at the Rainbow in North London in aid of the Queen's Silver Jubilee Trust in 1977, Elton John was asked by Princess Alexandra in the backstage conversation, "Do you take cocaine?" The princess later apologised for the indiscretion. But when the Sun struck in 1987, Elton had been married to recording engineer Renate Blauer for more than 3 years. It was well known that the marriage, which was to end effectively that spring, was in trouble, but he had more than his own reputation to protect. Moreover, he was completely innocent of the charges Hardy made. The police later looked into the allegations, but no action was taken. No one who came into regular contact with rent boys, such as the charities who look after them or the Vice Squad, had ever heard Elton John being talked about by a punter, by the boys on the streets. Elton was a wronged man. When the story broke, the rock star was in Australia, recovering from an operation on a growth in his throat, which at one time he feared was cancerous. Friends, including it is said Mick Jagger, advised him to ride the storm. If he were to sue, the Sun might go looking for dirt. It's a nasty consideration that keeps many public figures at bay. Nevertheless, the sort of mud the Sun was flinging has a habit of sticking. The first to dump Elton was Cadbury's, who had brought him up to front a major promotional campaign for their chunky nut bar, Dairy Milk, Whole Nut, and Fruit Nut, and Nut Chocolate. The pop star was no stranger to the High Court, having the year before won almost $5 million after suing his first music publisher, Dick James, over song rights. The Sun was totally unprepared for the force of Elton's counterattack. Elton later told the Daily Express, "They can say I'm a fat old sod, they can say I'm an untalented bastard, they can call me a puff, but they mustn't lie about me." The first writ from Elton's solicitor, Frank Presland, of the solicitors Frere Cholmondeley, was issued so fast that the second Graham X story on the Thursday, the 26th of February, was printed with the caption, "The story they're all suing over." Schadenfreude is nowhere indulged in with more glee than in Fleet Street. On the same day that the Sun published its second story, the Daily Mirror's almighty 4-letter front-page headline screamed lies, with the subheadline, "I was in New York and I can prove it says pop superstar." The Mirror story by John Blake showed that on the only specific date mentioned in the Sun's original Graham X story linking Elton with the Rent Boys, on the 30th of April 1986, Elton was in New York, being whisked about in a limousine. The Mirror had the receipts. More intriguing still was a vanishing story trailed in the Sun. At the bottom of the first orgy story, published on the 25th, was a white-on-black block signposting the next day's scoop. Tomorrow, Elton's pink tutu party. The story never appeared. It probably fell victim to the large holes which were beginning to appear in Graham X's evidence. Witnesses were piling up to say that they had never seen Elton John at Billy Gaff's parties, never in fact seen him at Billy Gaff's house. But the Sun's game plan was to keep hitting Elton so hard that he would give up long before a judge had heard the matter. The second front page splash on Thursday the 26th of February was headlined Elton's Kinky Kinks, followed on pages 4 and 5 by Elton's Drug Capers. The Sun was claiming, among other things, that Elton demanded that young male prostitutes found for him should be drugged with vast amounts of coke before they could be brought to his bed. Elton sued. The following day, on Friday the 27th of February, the Sun printed, "You're a liar, Elton." Elton sued again. One man who was concerned about the story was Rupert Murdoch. According to a Sun mole, Murdoch treats Mackenzie with the affection shown by a teacher to the naughtiest boy in class, whom he has to punish but secretly admires the most. He has been known to call Mackenzie "my little Hitler." But when the writ started to fly, there were worries that Elton would boycott the Murdoch-owned television outlets. Sun reporters were soon trading versions of a phone call described by Mackenzie in his booming voice. The story is that Mackenzie was woken at home in the wee hours of the night by the familiar Australian voice calling from one of 5 continents when used international instincts. Murdoch: "Kelvin, are we alright on this Elton John business?" Mackenzie: "Yes, boss." Murdoch: "All right." Click. The brevity of the phone call, it is said, left Kelvin twitching with worry. Another man who lost sleep over the Elton and Vice Boy scandal was John Boyce. Boyce is a Scottish conman, gay pimp, and former rent boy who went to the same school as John Reid, Elton's manager. Asked about his criminal record, Boyce told a Thames television journalist, "The largest amount of convictions I've got is for fraud. I've got 9 convictions for fraud, and I've got 1 for attempted murder." This was the saviour the Sun turned to in its hour of need. Boyce had been toying with the idea of flogging a rent boy story to the tabloids and was horrified to see the prospect of good money slipping into someone else's hands. When the first Graham X story broke, he phoned the Sun immediately, offering his services as a go-between. Boyce was willing to hunt down rent boys and secure affidavits from them which would support the thrust of the Sun's allegations for a price. Boyce, who worked out of a gay pub in Manchester, had been brought up by a former People journalist called Terry Lovell. Lovell is writing a book about the affair, so Boyce was unavailable for interview with the Independent magazine, where this article was originally written. Lovell, who broke the Harry Proctor spanking story and many other sordid revelations with rent boys, has junked his £37,000 a job for the People after having found God. He now works for Christian Bookseller Review. Lovell told the UK Press Gazette, "I honestly could take no more. The cheating, the lying, the conniving, and the utter pointlessness of many of the stories I was no longer able to justify." Being born again did not prevent Lovell from taking a modest fee for introducing Boyce to the Thames televisions this week. The uncut interview at the Apollo Club between the granite-jawed Thames reporter Lindsay Charlton and John Boyce is a model of its kind, as this section shows. Boyce. Basically, the whole idea was at the beginning of it was to get people to dig dirt against Elton John and Charlton. What sort of statement did they want? Boyce. Basically, they wanted to crown the guy, and he was in the honours list at the time. So they, the Sun, turned around and says, "By the way, can you dig up any kind of crap on the guy?" And we used to bring people to hotel rooms so that they would tell us that they had an affair with Elton John, and I meant it was all pure crap. Boyce's attitude to his work was that it was a nice little earner. He was paid £1,750 for each affidavit, passing on about £500 to each rent boy signed up. Not all the rent boys got £500 promised by Boyce. Not all the signatories had ever been rent boys, and it transpired none of them had ever done anything that they told Boyce they had done with Elton John. After a couple of weeks, the Sun realised it had been had and stopped paying Boyce. Having cut its losses with Boyce, the paper redoubled its efforts to get dirt on Elton John, as Mick Jagger had predicted. The Sun's Elton John squad included Wallace and its Midlands reporter Andrew Parker. According to the Sun Mole, they scoured the planet. Elton's solicitors started to get reports from places as far as Melbourne, Manchester, Los Angeles, Scotland and London. The strangers were making inquiries about the star's sexual history and habits. Meanwhile, in Twyford, all was not well with the Hardy household. It had taken the rest of Fleet Street about 24 hours to trace American Barry to his council house, but as yet no one had got a picture of him. The Sun blanked out his face in Elton's kinky kinks to preserve his anonymity. It is part of the samurai code of honour among tabloids that when one paper buys up a contact and keeps his identity secret, all others must do their damnedest to find out who he is and print the worst. The siege moved en bloc to the house of Hardy's girlfriend's parents in a cul-de-sac just off the A4. What I was saying earlier about, ordinary people being demolished by these sorts of things. There you go. The Sun decided to get Hardy, girlfriend and baby out of the country before he was questioned too closely by the opposition, with the Daily Mirror at the head of the pack. The Sun's Thames Valley reporter, John Askill, a large man nicknamed the Jolly Green Giant, was detailed to babysit the Hardys. But first, the Sun had to get them out of the cul-de-sac and off to the airport. The Fleet Street pack had parked outside the house, hoping to take snatch pics of Hardy as Hardy was moved out. The Jolly Green Giant rose to the occasion. Hardy, always acutely conscious of how he dresses, recalls the episode with genuine hurt. Askill wrapped me up in a balaclava and a scarf, put a blanket over my head. When we came out of the house, Askill left me standing there with a blanket over my head, looking stupid as he said, "Hello," to all his mates and the other newspapers. Next, 4 taxis, hired by the Sun, arrived and blocked off the cul-de-sac, parting like the Red Sea to let the Sun's car out, but closing again to stop his car. To stop the pack from following. However, one of the opposition reporters had parked his car on the A4, so an epic car chase across the home counties followed. The chase meant that when the Sun car finally lost the opposition, its passengers had missed their flights to Spain. Hardy, girlfriend, baby and Askill flew to Paris instead. They spent 4 days at the Hotel Sofitel at Charles de Gaulle Airport near Paris. Then they flew first class to Malaga before driving to the 5-star Melia Don Pepe in Marbella. Hardy was greatly chuffed. It really was high living. But after a while, the foreign lifestyle lost its appeal. The girlfriend didn't want to feed her baby on Spanish baby food, so a Woman's Son reporter flew out with fresh stocks bought from a proper British supermarket. Before returning, the exiles spent a couple of days in Gibraltar, where Hardy took the Sun Man's picture framed against the rock. All in all, Hardy spent a month abroad at the Sun's expense. Back in Britain, the trawl for filth on Elton John had finally come up with something. Tom Petrie, the Sun's news editor, had to get a thick wad of used readies for an exchange, which was something out of a le Carré novel. The trade-off took place underneath the stark searchlights outside the Sun's Wapping fortress, before the mystery supplier refused point-blank to enter the plant. Because what the Sun got for its money were 3 Polaroid photographs depicting Elton John in, first, a full frontal nude shot, secondly, warmly cuddling another man, and thirdly, the man and Elton John in a compromising position. David Shapland, the paper's deputy editor, was heard to say, "I've got a lot of Elton John tapes in my Porsche, but I now can't bear to listen to them." The Polaroids were deeply embarrassing for Elton, who had never lived a life of monastic sobriety, but they were not supporting evidence of the original Graham X story that Elton used rent boys. The man in the photographs was a consenting adult, not a rent boy. The pictures were taken in the late 70s or very early 80s, long before Elton was married. The Sun made sure Elton saw the Polaroids before they were published. It was, the paper thought, a knockout punch. Calvin Mackenzie was convinced that Elton would fold. Someone who was close to Elton at the time told me, Elton realised those photographs looked pretty bad for him, but they didn't have anything to do with Graham X. There was a lot of pressure on Elton to settle with the Sun, but he said no. Elton showed tremendous guts. So, cut to the chase. Finally, at the end of all of this, Elton took the Sun to court, and the Sun eventually was forced to pay £1 million plus damages. And I was wrong at the start of the podcast. It wasn't 1989. It was 1988 that the case was concluded, and the matter was laid to rest. But what does this show? I mean, other than a kind of a sort of a story of tabloid malfeasance, it shows the impunity with which Britain's newspaper industry is able to operate in the UK. And imagine that this happens to people without the resources to sue all the time. This is possible because of a very close relationship during the 1980s between the Murdoch empire and other right-wing Fleet Street newspapers and the Conservative government. And in the 1990s, the late 1990s, the very cosy arrangements made between New Labour and the tabloid press. It gives the tabloid press a disproportionate political, social and cultural power in the United Kingdom, even though most people in Britain are, fairly appalled by the idea of press intrusion. This is a country that really appreciates the idea of privacy, and the idea that that private vices or private behaviours can be held up as public vices. We may be approaching an end point to all of this, but it's important not to kind of count your chickens before they've hatched, really. The Sun might limp along for a considerable time to come. Anyway, I kind of like the Faber Book of Pop. It's a really interesting anthology, well worth having on your shelf, edited by Hanif Qureshi and John Savage. And I think I'll kind of delve back into that, because it does present us, it's less about, Elton John or whoever else, and more kind of a snapshot of British social and cultural history, and not just Great Britain either. Anyway, let's leave it there. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks, all the best, bye-bye.